On July 20th, 1846, inside Lumford Mill in Derbyshire, England, a 22-year-old worker named James Mills reached toward a machine he had tended hundreds of times before. The horizontal shaft beside him spun at its usual speed. No warning sounded. In less than a second, his sleeve caught the rotating steel, and his body was pulled into the mechanism. His co-workers watched helplessly as the shaft whipped him around until his life ended. A memorial stone was later erected by his fellow workers, inscribed with 6 words that summarized everything: suddenly killed by being caught by a shaft. James Mills was not alone. Across Britain, across Europe, across America, the same scene repeated in textile mills, machine shops, and printing houses. Workers arrived before dawn and worked beneath ceilings lined with spinning steel. These were line shafts, rotating metal rods that stretched the entire length of factory floors, transferring power from a single engine to every machine in the building. Leather belts hung from overhead pulleys like dark vines. The system hummed and slapped and never stopped, and anyone who came too close paid with fingers, limbs, or lives. This is the story of the power system that built modern industry and killed workers by the thousands while doing it. Factories did not install line shafts because they wanted workers to die. They installed them because there was no other way to power a building full of machines. Before electric motors existed, a factory needed a central power source, a steam engine, a water wheel, something large and expensive that generated rotational force. But that power sat in one location, usually a basement or engine house. The machines that needed it were spread across entire floors, sometimes multiple stories. How do you get power from the basement to the 3rd floor? How do you run 100 machines from a single engine? Line shafts solved that problem. A vertical main shaft connected to the power source and ran upward through each level of the building. On every floor, horizontal shafts attached to the ceiling and extended the full length of the workspace. Leather belts dropped from pulleys on these shafts down to individual machines: looms, lathes, presses, drills. When the engine turned, everything turned. In 1828, Paul Moody introduced leather belting at Appleton Mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, replacing the older gear systems that were loud, inefficient, and prone to breakage. This single innovation made belt-driven line shafts the industry standard almost overnight. Higher speeds, easier maintenance, lower cost, and factory owners loved cost. I need to pause here for a moment. If you find these industrial history investigations valuable, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and let me know in the comments what forgotten dangers you'd like me to uncover next. Now, back to the machinery. Installing one large steam engine and a network of line shafts was far cheaper than equipping each machine with its own power source. For small and medium factories operating on tight margins, this wasn't a preference. It was pure survival. By the mid-19th century, belt-driven shafts were standard in textile mills across America and Britain. The industry exploded from a handful of mills in the 1820s to hundreds by the 1870s. Near the century's end, some factories contained a mile or more of line shafts in a single building. Why did no one question the danger? Because the danger was the design. The spinning steel overhead wasn't a flaw, it was the feature. Once factories learned to depend on that rotating network, there was no stepping back, and the consequences would be measured in blood and bone. Writing in 1909, engineer James Hobart made an observation that still stops me cold. He said that you could scarcely step into a shop or factory of any description without encountering a mass of belts which seemed to monopolize every nook in the building and leave little or no room for anything else. He was not exaggerating. Line shafts dominated factory interiors the way arteries dominate a body. Horizontal steel rods stretched along ceilings for the entire length of each floor. From these shafts, leather belts dropped down to individual machines, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, all fed by the same rotating spine. Workers did not simply work near this system, they worked inside it. Every station was surrounded by moving parts. Every pathway passed beneath spinning steel. Could you imagine working a 12-hour shift in that environment? Steel rotating overhead, leather belts slapping and whipping beside you. The knowledge that one wrong move, one stumble, one loose thread could pull you into a machine that would not stop for anything. The speeds were deceptive. Main shafts typically rotated at over 100 revolutions per minute. That sounds manageable until you calculate belt velocity. At larger pulleys, belts traveled at speeds reaching 1,000 feet per minute. To an observer standing still, the motion looked almost calm. To physics, it was relentless force that never paused, and it never did pause. The entire system ran continuously. Stopping one machine meant manually shifting a belt from a fixed pulley to a loose one, while the shaft kept spinning inches away. Shutting down the main engine wasted fuel and time, so factories kept everything running for entire shifts, sometimes for days. The noise was unbearable. Workers in textile mills became expert lip readers because verbal communication was impossible. The air filled with dust shed constantly from belts. Oil dripped from overhead bearings onto workers, floors, and products. Baldwin Locomotive Works later estimated that line shaft systems consumed 40% more space than electric motors would require. Factories were designed around power distribution, not production efficiency. Let me be clear about what this meant. Every improvement was blocked. Overhead shafts interfered with lighting. They blocked ventilation ducts. They prevented overhead cranes from operating safely. Even factory owners who wanted better conditions had no room to install them. The system demanded total accommodation. Workers adapted their movements, their clothing, their awareness. They learned to live surrounded by machinery that could kill them at any moment. But the sheer presence of the system was not what made it deadly. The real danger came from something far more insidious: the physics of what happened when human flesh met rotating steel. And as we'll soon find out, the spinning shaft did not care how careful you were. One loose thread was all it needed. A line shaft did not wait for victims. It grabbed them. Unlike a blade that cuts or a weight that crushes, a rotating shaft actively pulled. A sleeve brushing against the surface, an apron string dangling too close, a strand of hair falling forward during a moment of exhaustion. The instant contact occurred, the shaft began winding. It did not slow down. It did not hesitate. It pulled. Here's why that matters. A shaft rotating at 100 revolutions per minute sounds almost gentle, but calculate what happens at the surface. A 3-inch diameter shaft at that speed moves its outer edge at roughly 80 feet per minute. That still sounds survivable until fabric touches it. Within a fraction of a second, the victim's clothing wraps around the shaft multiple times. Each revolution increases friction. Each wrap tightens the grip. There is no slipping free. The rotation converts the engine's full power, dozens or hundreds of horsepower, into pulling force concentrated on a single human body. No one could resist it. No bystander could intervene in time. Even if someone sprinted to the engine controls the moment they saw a co-worker caught, the distance and the speed of the event made rescue impossible. The shaft completed multiple revolutions per second. By the time anyone reacted, the damage was done. Surgeon Samuel Smith testified to Parliament in 1832 about what he witnessed at Leeds General Infirmary. He described cases in which the arm had been torn off near the shoulder joint. He spoke of upper extremities chopped into small fragments from the tip of the finger to above the elbow. He called them the most shocking cases of lacerations that it was possible to conceive. And this was routine. This was normal. This was what happened when line shafts worked exactly as designed. Could you imagine standing inches from that force for 12 hours straight? Could you imagine doing it 6 days a week, year after year, knowing that one moment of inattention could end everything? The cruelest part was the invisibility. A steam boiler announced its danger. Pressure gauges climbed, metal groaned, heat radiated outward. A line shaft gave no warning whatsoever. It looked identical, whether it was about to kill someone or simply running another ordinary shift. Workers grew accustomed to the sound, the motion, the presence. Familiarity replaced caution. That familiarity was lethal. Workers passed within inches of this force every hour of every shift. They leaned over it. They reached across it. They cleaned beneath it while it spun. The question was never whether someone would be caught. It was when. And the systems meant to protect them. Those failed for reasons that would take decades to understand. And that still left workers completely unprotected. The laws existed. They just did not work. Britain's Factory Act of 1844 required that mill gearing, including power shafts, be securely fenced. On paper, this sounded like protection. In practice, it was barely an inconvenience. Magistrates interpreted the requirement inconsistently. If shafting ran above head height, many courts ruled it did not need guarding at all. The law contained loopholes large enough to kill through. Factory owners exploited every one of them. Fencing machinery cost money. It reduced access to equipment. It slowed production. And here is what the owners understood perfectly. It was cheaper to pay nominal fines for injuries than to install proper guards. One historical analysis put it plainly: the rapidly expanding economic activity provided employers with financial incentives to ignore the law. So they ignored it. Enforcement was nearly impossible anyway. When the Factory Act of 1833 first established inspectors, only 4 were appointed to cover all textile mills in Britain. 4 people, thousands of factories. Systematic monitoring was a fantasy. Leonard Horner served as one of those inspectors for 26 years. His reports documented widespread non-compliance. He described workers twirled around shafts until they were beaten to death. 16 killed in a single inspection period alone. Karl Marx later praised Horner for his dedication to working people, but dedication without power changes nothing. Children suffered worst of all. Regulations limited their working hours, so factories invented relay systems, rotating young workers in shifts to keep machines running beyond legal limits, while technically complying with individual hour caps. The law was followed in letter and violated in spirit. And despite explicit prohibitions against children cleaning moving machinery, the practice continued everywhere. Young workers, called scavengers, crawled beneath operating equipment to collect cotton waste, timing their movements to avoid being crushed by mechanisms that never stopped. Many did not time it correctly. Let me tell you something. When a 9-year-old is pulled into a machine while cleaning cotton scraps, calling it carelessness is not an explanation. It is an excuse. But that was exactly how deaths were reported. Newspapers blamed victims for their own recklessness. Coroners concluded workers had been negligent. The system that demanded human beings operate inches from lethal machinery was never questioned. Only the dead were held accountable. Over 93% of mill accident patients at Leeds Infirmary in 1 year during the 1830s had severe injuries to hands, thumbs, or fingers. This was not bad luck. This was the predictable result of unguarded machinery and unenforced regulations. Even owners who genuinely wanted safer conditions faced impossible choices. Guards that protected workers without blocking necessary access simply did not exist yet. The technology that enabled production had outpaced the technology of protection. The regulations existed on paper. Workers kept dying anyway. And the accounts of what they experienced will stay with you. Robert Blincoe never forgot what he saw. He was working in a textile mill around 1800 when it happened. A girl named Mary Richards attended a drawing frame nearby. She was approximately 9 or 10 years old, described as remarkably handsome when she had left the workhouse. Below the frame, about a foot from the floor, ran a horizontal shaft that powered the machinery above. One evening, her apron caught the shaft. In an instant, the girl was drawn by an irresistible force and dashed to the floor. Blincoe ran toward her, an agonized and helpless witness to a scene of horror. He watched her whirled round and round with the shaft. He heard the bones of her arms, legs, and thighs successively snap asunder, crushed seemingly to atoms as the machinery drew tighter and tighter her body within the works. Her blood scattered over the frame and streamed upon the floor. Her head appeared dashed to pieces. Could you imagine being 9 years old and having that be your final moment? Could you imagine being Robert Blincoe, watching helplessly as a child you knew was destroyed in front of you? I will repeat that. She was 9 years old, maybe 10. Her crime was having an apron. This was not a unique horror. It was a pattern. On March 6, 1865, at Quarrybank Mill, a boy was sweeping under a spinning mule when his head was caught between the roller beam and the carriage as the machinery moved. The records state his head was completely smashed. Death was instantaneous. He was one entry in an accident book that documented tragedy after tragedy at a single facility. One study of a mill near Cork revealed 6 people killed and 60 others mutilated over a 4-year period. At Manchester Infirmary in 1833, 40% of all accident cases were factory-related. Surgeon Samuel Smith described to Parliament accidents of the most dreadful kind that it was possible to conceive. And the dead had names. James Mills, age 22, killed at Lumford Mill on July 20th, 1846. His co-workers paid for his memorial stone because the factory paid nothing. The inscription captured everything in 6 words: suddenly killed by being caught by a shaft. Could you imagine that being your epitaph? 6 words, no explanation, no accountability. Children bore the worst of it. They were sent to mills from workhouses as apprentices, unpaid labor, in exchange for food and a place to sleep. They worked 12 to 14 hours daily. Being small, they were assigned the most dangerous tasks, crawling beneath moving machinery, cleaning spaces adults could not reach. If they fell asleep at their stations, they were beaten. Some were as young as 4 years old. Many accidents occurred in the final hours of shifts. After 12 or more hours of labor, exhaustion degraded every reflex. A hand moved too slowly. A head nodded forward. The shaft was always waiting. It did not care about age or fatigue or how many hours remained until the bell. The machinery never stopped. The children could not stop. Something had to give. It was always the children. But the damage did not end with the workers directly caught. The consequences spread outward, into families, into communities, and into an entire system that refused to accept any responsibility for what it had created. When a worker died, the family died with them. Not physically, financially. James Mills was mourned by co-workers who collected money to erect his memorial stone. The factory contributed nothing. Michael Markham, killed at a Connecticut screw factory in 1885, left behind a widowed mother and sister who depended entirely on his wages. When the machinery took him, it took their future too, and the law offered no help. Workers had virtually no legal rights to compensation. Employers wielded what historians call the unholy trinity of defenses. If the worker was even slightly at fault, contributory negligence, the employer owed nothing. If another worker's actions caused the injury, the fellow servant rule. The employer owed nothing. If the accident was simply part of the job, assumption of risk, the employer owed nothing. Estimates suggest only 1 in 8 injured workers received any compensation through lawsuits. The rest received silence. Could you imagine surviving a mangling injury, losing your ability to work, and then discovering the law considered it your own fault? The philosophy was brutally simple. Unhistorical analysis described it plainly. Workers were reduced to nothing more than a commodity, the same as the raw materials used in the factories. If a commodity was damaged or destroyed, it was discarded and forgotten. New immigrants lined up outside factory gates every morning. Dead workers were simply replaced. What I am telling you is this: the system was not just dangerous, it was designed to absorb human loss without accountability. Mill towns had no alternatives. Entire communities depended on factory employment. Challenging safety conditions meant risking termination, not just for yourself, but potentially for family members working alongside you. Injured workers who could not return became burdens on families and local parishes. Economic power silenced every complaint before it could be spoken. Public awareness came slowly. By the late 1820s, accounts like Robert Blincoe's memoir created what historians call the man-eating machine genre. In newspapers, these stories connected comfortable readers to the suffering of factory workers. The humanitarian narrative began building pressure for reform. But factory owners pushed back hard. In 1855, they formed the National Association of Factory Occupiers specifically to watch over factory legislation with a view to prevent any increase of the present unfair and injudicious enactments. They successfully lobbied for an 1856 act that weakened guarding requirements for shafts deemed not readily accessible. Here is what made change so difficult. Unlike boiler explosions, dramatic single events that focused public attention, line shaft deaths occurred individually and continuously. No single disaster galvanized outrage. Each death was treated as isolated, an accident, not a pattern. The violence was distributed across thousands of factories and decades of time, invisible precisely because it was everywhere. Something had to force change. It would not be conscience. Owners had demonstrated immunity to that. It would not be regulation. The laws were written with loopholes and enforced with indifference. It would be something factory owners actually cared about. And that change was already arriving in the form of a technology that would make the spinning steel overhead completely unnecessary. The technology that ended the slaughter arrived quietly. In the early 1900s, electric motors began appearing in factories. At first, manufacturers simply replaced steam engines with large electric motors that drove existing line shaft systems. The shafts kept spinning. The danger remained. But after 1900, smaller industrial motors became available, and everything changed. Unit drive. One motor attached directly to one machine. No overhead shafts. No belts hanging beside workstations. No rotating steel waiting to grab anyone who came too close. Power was contained within each machine, rather than distributed across entire buildings through exposed spinning systems. When a worker needed to stop their machine, they stopped their machine, not the entire factory. You would think manufacturers would have embraced this immediately. They did not. Historian Harold Platt documented the resistance. Large amounts of capital were already sunk in power equipment, steam boiler plants, mechanical shafts, belts and pulleys, and factory designs built specifically around these systems. The sales pitch for electric power fell on deaf ears because it asked managers to abandon their existing investment. Familiarity protected the old system even after better alternatives existed. Sound familiar? What finally forced the transition was not safety. It was economics and circumstance. Coal shortages during World War I pushed manufacturers toward electric power. Government policies accelerated the shift. Between 1919 and 1929, American industry largely abandoned line shafts in favor of unit electric drives. A transformation that should have taken generations happened in roughly a decade. The results were measurable. Firms switching to electric power showed significantly less employee sick time. Production increased because factory layouts could finally be designed for workflow efficiency rather than power distribution. The overhead jungle of shafts and belts disappeared. Oil stopped dripping from ceiling bearings. Belt dust cleared from the air. Workers could finally hear each other speak. It is worth noting what actually ended the danger, not the deaths, those that accumulated for over a century. Not the regulations, those were written with loopholes and enforced with indifference. Competition ended it. Once safer systems proved cheaper and more reliable, the logic that justified overhead shafts collapsed, just as James Mills was killed by a technology that seemed permanent and necessary. That same technology proved entirely replaceable when something better arrived. The line shaft era left a lesson that still applies today. The line shaft taught industry a brutal truth. The systems we build to increase productivity can just as easily increase death. For over a century, workers operated beneath spinning steel because no one imagined an alternative. The danger was accepted because it was everywhere. Familiarity made it invisible. What ended the slaughter wasn't moral outrage. It was better technology combined with economic pressure. The lesson applies far beyond factories. Danger normalized is danger sustained. The only protection is constant vigilance and the willingness to abandon systems that cost lives, even when they seem essential. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll remember James Mills.